Welcome everyone to this third episode of the Gallery Reflection. The Gallery Reflection is happening for every chapter of our year-long exhibition and research program that is dedicated to analyzing the colonial structure on the everyday. And tonight we will be talking about art and intersectional feminism, and you see very prominent this new. And it's in resonance to our chapter looking at forms of feminism. So tonight, in this place, what you see here, and we could do a tour after the talk, is the exhibition of Wura-Natasha Ogunji. And for this gallery reflection, it's more like looking at cultural practices, curatorial practices, art, and anthropology, looking at how do we actually move from the very dusty institution and something that always arrives at the end, but how could actually an institution be something which follows the changes of a society and actually can protect these changes. So we are trying to develop long-term strategies, and one of them, and the most important, I believe, is to recognize the people who have been doing such an important work on creating a shift when we're talking about intersectional feminism. And that's why I'm extremely, extremely happy. Merci, Jonas, for proposing this, and thank you for every single one of you to be there tonight. Jonas, you will do the formal presentation, but I will focus on this idea of continuity. So with Kathy and Anne, we started already with publishing a wonderful essay on our digital platform. You did the performance with Wura-Natasha Ogunji, and you will be having a discussion with her during the closing event. With Federica, who is one of the mastermind of Speaking Feminism at Savi, will do a performance at Savi on January 11th with Tracy Rose. And with Alanna, it has been already in the moment of the creation of the program. I've been following what you have been doing, and we will continue with the BE.BOP next year on the 9th of June. Voilà, that's all for me. Jonas, c'est à toi.
Thanks for coming to the ifa-Galerie tonight, and thanks as usual to Alia for hosting us, and also for the gallery team, of course, for making all of this possible. This discussion tonight, as she said, is the third of 5 gallery reflections taking place as part of the one-year theme and program Untie to Tie. And the gallery reflections are a series of public discussions on art, anthropology, curatorial practice, and institutional thinking that take place in the gallery once in between every one of the 4 main exhibitions that constitute this program. And the idea behind this series is to make space for subjective and reflexive perspectives that do not strictly relate to each of the 4 chapters of the one-year program, but which crisscross the overall themes and decenter the focal points of each exhibition. The idea of a reflection then is not meant in the sense of a reflex, like an instinctive physical reaction to something, but rather in the sense of a light ray that breaks with the usual way of thinking and seeing, one that, like a prism, pries open the spectrum and makes visible that which is otherwise unseen. Beyond the specific themes we discuss for each event, the series is also part of a dialogue, as Alia mentioned, between anthropology and curatorial practice, one that tries to think of this conversation as a way of speaking nearby, to borrow from Trinity Minya, and not one of speaking about. It is for this reason that we adopted the idea of the anthropologist and the curator as sparring partners, partners who help each other stay alert, attentive, on their feet, and one that forces you to rethink your own moves and thoughts. And for those interested in this idea, you can read an opening essay on the Untie to Tie website, or come to Paris on the 5th of December, where Ali and I will be reflecting on the series at Kara Atia's new space, La Colonie. So for each of these gallery reflections, we have brought together 3 artists, activists, and scholars to debate and discuss with me and with all of you, the audience. Our first event took place and took inspiration from the opening exhibition by Cameroonian artist Pascal Martin Taillou, which problematized the logic of colonial ghosts, being inspired itself by the city of Kolmanskop, a former colonial German settlement and now ghost town in the Namib desert. Making reference to the name of the first chapter, Global Relatedness, and the thought of Edouard Glissant, we opened the gallery reflections with an event entitled Urban Decolonization and Diasporic Formations. Discussing with me at that event were the urban scholar Noah Ha, artist Hyun-Shin Kim, and the anthropologist Chang Tran Tu. Our second event, for which we wanted to focus on the much used but sort of unreflected dimensions of temporality that are often part of discussions on colonialisms and actually also present in the subtitle of this one-year program, Colonial Legacies. We did an event that was called Traces, Legacies and Futures, a conversation on art and temporality, for which we discussed heritage, hacktivism and the future with art historian Khadija von Zinnenburg-Carroll, artist Nora Al-Badri, who talked about her project, the Nofretiti hack, that some of you may be aware of, and my colleague from the Institute of European Ethnology, Professor Sylvie Chakalakal. Tonight, we chose a theme that makes direct reference not just to the show behind us or around us, curated by Eva Barrois de Savel, and called Every Mask I Ever Loved, which takes place within chapter 3 of the program called Intersectional Feminisms. And the exhibited artist, Wura-Natasha Ogunji, I should also add, will actually be one of the curators of the upcoming Sao Paulo Biennale, and will return in January next year for the finissage performance here at IFA. So tonight we want to talk about the role of art in the quest for an intersectional feminist political economy, reflecting on how artistic practices may articulate or critique this position. We also said that we want to discuss about the legacies of past and pioneering iterations of black feminist intersectional thought and activism, which gave rise to the concept in its current guise, and how that may relate to new generations of artists, academics, and activists. And in the run-up to our conversation for this event today, we formulated this sentence. We formulated that intersectional feminism acknowledges and underlines how the structural, global, and subjective entanglements of race, class, ethnicity, religion, health, able-bodiedness, and gender affect women's and trans people's experiences. Intersectional feminisms is a term which in turn we wish to recognize its roots in black feminist thought, and specifically the writings of civil rights advocate Kimberlé Crenshaw. And intersectional feminism, of course, in that sense, wishes to recognize the radical and yet to some extent commonsensical proposition that forms of oppression vary according to the multi-layered facets of one's identity. But it's therefore more than just about identity and about society-wide structures of power and discrimination that need to be discussed. And to discuss this tonight, I'm honored and very happy to welcome Federica, Bueti, Alana Lockwood, and Kathy and Tan. And I'll just very briefly say something. I've got shortened bios, so they're not going to be too long. Kathy Ann, who's sitting on the far left here, is a Berlin-based academic in American studies, whose interests lie in the fields of post-colonial and decolonial studies, gender and queer studies, visual cultures, and poetry. And her current research project, The Aesthetics of Decolonization, Performance, Affect, and Visual Perception, explores how dominant narratives of Western modernity are unhinged and challenged in visual art, performance, and museum interventions. And Kathy Ann, I should also add, also took part in the opening performance for this show and wrote a reflection on Wura's work, about which we'll hear in a moment. And I should also add that she's just come from 2 days of straight teaching in Paderborn, so an extra special thanks for her to coming tonight. Federica, who's sitting in our middle, is a writer and editor, also based in Berlin, whose research focuses on feminist politics and economies of writing. She's part of the curatorial team at Berlin's Savvy Contemporary, where she curates the series Speaking Feminisms, dedicated to an exploration of current feminist practices and alliances, which is also collaborating with ifa-Galerie. And she's currently completing her PhD in critical writing in art at the Royal College of Art in London, and she's going to be speaking about the relation of writing to intersectional and feminist thought. And then lastly, we're extremely fortunate that we managed to have you with us, Alana Lockwood, who's a Dominican-German author, curator, and filmmaker, and founding editor of Art Labor Archives. Her interests lie among many other things, in Caribbean Marinage Legacies, Critical Race Theory, Decolonial Aesthetics, Black Feminism and Womanist Ethics, and she was founder of BE.BOP in 2012, which is, as many of you will know, an incredible network, an institutionalized and an institutionalizing network of artists, activists, and scholars problematizing, among other things, Black European body politics. And she also opened this year's Decolonize the Arts seminar series at the UDK, and will be telling us more about that. We'll be speaking for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for discussions and drinks and more informal discussion if you want to stay. Kathy, I wanted to start with you and actually go back to this particular essay that you wrote and your in a sense, your experience of Wura's work, because one of the things that we haven't done so much in previous gallery reflections was actually to situate our discussion within the particular show that some of you may have seen, but not everybody may be familiar with. And so I wondered whether you could maybe start by telling us a little bit about how you got to know Wura's work, what it meant for you, and what inspired you to write that text that, of course, everybody has read or will read afterwards.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Thank you, Alia, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. So sure, I could talk a little bit about how I first came to encounter Wura's amazing work. I really respect her as an artist. So how this came about was basically in the fall of 2015 when I was in Los Angeles doing some research for my current project on decolonial aesthetics. So I was thinking, so basically what I wanted to do was what I do in my everyday practice as a researcher who is also based in the very privileged structure of academia, so inside but also outside of academia. So what I wanted to do and what I'm doing as part of my project is really to engage on a very practical level with actually what Ngugi wa Thiong'o called in a very famous book that I'm very sure a lot of you have read from 1986 called Decolonizing the Mind. How this came about was, as I was saying, really to engage on a very practical level and not just a kind of abstract theoretical level with the question of how I engage with, how I think through and how I think with decolonial and transfeminist queer strategies and practices in my work and in my research. So in the fall of 2015, I was very fortunate. I spent 4 amazing months in Los Angeles, and I went to an art exhibition called Disguise at the Fowler Museum in Los Angeles. It's actually on the campus of UCLA. And what's interesting, and I think what's also relevant for actually your work, Jonas, in anthropology and your project on museums, is basically that the Fowler Museum is one of these ethnographic institutions, one of these ethnographic museums, in which there are artifacts from all over the world. So basically there are African masks, there are relics, there are cultural artifacts, very much on display the way that we would, unfortunately expect, artifacts and relics to be displayed. And the Wura-Ogunji's work was part of this exhibition in the Disguise exhibition. And what I found really interesting about it was that what they did was that they invited artists, and Wura was, I think, one of about 15 different artists who were invited to basically to enact, to practice an intervention in the spaces of the museum. And so Wura's piece, the one that I saw and the one that I was very much affected by, was this piece, The Kissing Mask, and you can actually see this. This was performed again here with a different performer. Wura wasn't performing herself, it was Aishe. This is taken from, I believe, the opening night here in the ifa-Galerie, but this is basically the performance that I saw, was part of, was affected by. And I found this, so this then became part of a longer reflection, and then at some point I wrote an essay, which I guess is available in kind of shortened form on the website of Untitled. And it basically tried to convey what I felt when I was part of this piece. And basically what I felt was the decolonial intervention. So the intervention on Wura's part. So through a decolonial aesthetic, how she basically challenges this practice of, just simply housing or displaying cultural artifacts, in this instance, African masks, in the space of the Fowler Museum. So that was my entry point into Wura's work. So part of the piece, or the piece basically involves, it's a durational piece. If I can just briefly summarize what it was. It's so much more, of course, but basically it's a durational piece, and the first time I witnessed this in the Fowler Museum at UCLA, Wura was sitting there for, I think, about 2 hours. So she's wearing a mask that is a riff off of another drawing, which basically is also plays off of the idea or the actual, kind of visual appearance of what the Egungun mask is like. So a mask that is worn in a certain traditional ceremony in Yoruba culture. The performance basically involves Wura sitting there, not moving. And there is, so she's sitting on a plinth, and on another plinth there is a little note that encourages people from the audience to interact with the piece, to kiss the mask. And so I, of course, was extremely excited to kiss the mask, and I did, and there is a terribly embarrassing photo of me, which is not on the website, trying to do that. And I was really full of expectation, when I kissed the mask. I was, there are all these references to, kissing in art history, in performance works, Tracy Rose, etc. The kiss. So I was expecting all these wonderful things to happen, and basically nothing happened. So the mask was still, and there was no response. And I felt totally inadequate, I was, after that I was thinking, wow, like this is, so what's happening here? And so I went away, and I reflected a little bit on this, and so I wrote my piece, which is up on the Untitled website. So if you'd like to kind of, relive my experience, I guess you could read my essay. But basically that's how I came to Wura's work.
Something that I'd also like to speak a little bit about, and you said that it was okay for me to show that image, was you took part. You took part in a second performance. We'll slowly build up to it, yes. Which took place on the weekend that Wura was here in the gallery, yes. And this was from a performance she did that was called "If I Loved You." And for this performance, and you can actually, I think you can see the threads on the far right of this gallery. These threads, or similar threads, were used by a number of performers who were in the room to tie up their face and to stand, wait, and have visibly, and of course, and this is something I'd like you to reflect on a little bit more, specifically in reference to this conversation that we had with the performers afterwards, it also physically disfigured the face and created very interesting moments that, in a conversation we had the day after, various members who witnessed it and performed it and were part of it likened to some of the references and some of the experiences they had when looking at this canvas that was pierced by these needles and sort of covered by this thread. Because we spoke about the embodied experience of this in particular, and I wondered if you could maybe describe a little bit about your involvement in that piece.
Sure. So this was a very different piece from the kissing mask. So this was a piece called "If I Loved You," And basically what we did was, and there are a couple of people in this room who are actually also part of the performance, so maybe they can also speak about this, this experience. But basically what we did was we started wrapping thread or string around our faces, and the narrative, or what we said at the very beginning was, if I loved you, it was for your beauty. Now that you're no longer beautiful, I do not love you. And this was a piece that Wura conceived of, that was based off of probably quite a famous Frida Kahlo painting, in which she has cut off her hair, and there is hair lying basically at her feet. She's in a masculine suit, and so basically, as performers, we were asked to reflect on, you know, really a lot of different things. But personally, for me, what was very effective was also the dynamic, not only, you know, with myself, although that sounds a bit strange. You know, the experience of wrapping thread around your own face to the point of either disfigurement, but also of where you actually. So I was wrapping it to the point where I actually also almost cut my tongue, right? Like I was wrapping it around my lips and got into my teeth, and it's not like dental floss; it doesn't come out, right? So it's and so I think this piece really brought together, you know, notions of beauty, of what is beauty, notions of aesthetics, but also what does it mean if you're doing this to yourself, and increasingly you're trying to say this line, and then you are increasingly hampered from doing so. So what I took away with me, and I mean some of the parallels between this one and the Kissing Mask performance, and they are very different. I feel that they are very different. But personally, what I took away was really the kind of the very strong affect, and also the dynamic with the other performers in the room. So there were about I think 12 of us who were also standing on plinths, and the instructions we were given by Wura was also to basically feel each other and to feel, you know, the affect in the room amongst the performers without looking at one another. So I guess that was, for me, the experience of the piece. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think all three of these performances, another one that we haven't mentioned, of which there are traces in the gallery, Sweep.
Mm-hmm.
All three of these performances will take place again in January for the finissage.
I believe only the Kissing Mask will be performed.
Okay.
If I'm
anyway,
not
it's on the website, and there will be
Right.
discussions of these pieces again.
Right.
Yes. So yeah, thanks for sharing those
Yes, and Wura is here, right in the middle, with the orange bucket.
And one of these buckets is still in the corner here.
Yes, and the brooms are also still in the corner. And that was also a very different piece. That was a site-specific intervention here, just around the corner.
Okay. I'm supposed to speak into the mic, which I thought I did. But I wanted to switch over to you, Federica, because in our preparation for this, we realized that you are very different, or this is a very different way of approaching the question of art and intersectional feminism, particularly because your approach and your coming to the theme has actually been through writing, particularly. And I wondered whether you could reflect a bit more about your way of studying, but also engaging with questions of feminism through the issue of both active writing of the self, but also the being written out of literature, as it were. But maybe you could just tell us about how you came through literature.
First of all, thanks everybody for being here tonight, for coming to this event. And yes, as you say, it's right. I came to feminism through writing, through my engagement with writing, because I'm an art critic, I'm a writer, and I was extremely dissatisfied with the way art criticism was and still is written. I just couldn't find myself in a particular kind of language and jargon that is used in the art world. So I started looking at feminist writers and thinking writing as a practice, as a political practice. And in particular, I'm interested in the use of the personal writing, biographical writing, as a sort of like a means of social critique. And how feminists have been basically politicizing writing and politicizing the personal. So, and of course, this is a general, let's say, field, but then there is a particular interest. What interests to me about like writers such as Audre Lorde, Carla Lonzi, Italian feminist, Trinity Mina, and Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, is the way they like use personal writing to criticize a particular kind of identity construct. So the idea of using the personal, using the I to actually question identity, question existing of given identities. So this kind of writing becomes this place of, let's say, undoing what has been done, what is already done. And this is I found it like a very productive way of thinking about writing as a possibility to actually deconstruct identities. So that's our identity in writing, right? And just how to think about the way I don't know, a social background, or the way the social, a question of race or question of gender, color writing. For instance, I can give you the example of Toni Morrison, who reflects on how can I characterize, how can I speak of a black person, of a character, without, for instance, necessarily referring to color, but actually to culture, and so to the culture, to the black culture, or the culture that oppresses black. And so how do you find other ways to discuss certain issue? How do we make identity more fluid? How do we question them? And which is a kind of interesting, because usually the way personal is understood, especially if it's a personal that is kind of written by a woman, is this kind of confessional or the affirmation of subjectivity. And I think, no, actually writing has been used by feminists to undo all those, of the self and subjectivity. So in that sense, I'm very much interested in that aspect of writing. And but so part of my interest then converge or flew, like I said, flew into the project of Speaking Feminisms, which is a project I co-curate with the co-director of Savvi, a contemporary, Elena Gudio, and artist Natalie Bicoro. Unfortunately, they cannot be here. They're traveling at the moment. It would have been nice to have them here. But we had an incredible, very, very productive and interesting discussion, because we immediately realized when we started speaking feminisms, when we started this kind of thinking about feminist practices and politics today, we immediately realized we had very, very different understandings of what feminist practices are. So we had to find somehow a way of there was a desire to find a common ground, and that's why we started Speaking Feminisms as a kind of sort of research project. Indeed, we call exercises. We have exercise every month, so we invite curators, we invite artists, we invite thinkers, writers, activists to share their practices, their experiences with us. Precisely because what we are kind of trying to do is to build a common ground on which then to create a common ground on which to build a project, a new project on intersectional feminism. We decided in the case of Speaking Feminism not to speak of intersectional. We thought that it has been overused. So we decided, okay, let's talk about feminisms, and obviously Savvi, I don't know if you're familiar with the place, is has been looking at a Western and non-Western construct, has been been kind of doing a work of like undoing or decolonizing knowledge. So of course, speaking feminisms in the plural, because it's in many different languages, we have been addressing question of class, question of race, or ethnicity, gender and sexuality. And we invited different practitioners to basically share their thoughts and their practices, what they think about feminist politics today. And we hope out of that moment to create a new project, hopefully next year, a new program of performances and talks and discussion and eventually an exhibition.
And the word speaking as opposed to writing feminisms, could you say something about that? Because it's clearly a sort of an interesting combination of the performative that we spoke about in Wura's work, but you've invited a lot of writers as well who spoke about their writing, and I find that that's an interesting intersection at which you articulate through voice the kinds of theories that otherwise you would engage in writing. So I wondered if you could reflect on because you also use the word of an exercise, and I find the terminology that you use in that theory is very interesting, and I wondered if you could maybe reflect on those, unless you...
Well, let's say...
Please speak about it.
Well, let's speak about it. Definitely it came from something that was, I would say, like a big point for feminists, I think, across the world, that is the idea of speaking up, right? So that's the first gesture of like when you just, you had enough, like you have to speak up. That's what you need to do, or maybe remain silent. Like, you know, this idea of speaking also includes the idea of remaining silent. Remaining silent is also a strategy, right? That can be used as a mode of resistance as well. So there is this double idea of speaking, but also remaining silent. And also the idea that feminism is not one language, it's many languages. So the idea of kind of speaking many different languages. Yeah.
And of course, I think what's interesting about this series, especially using the word exercise, is the recognition of work in progress, the recognition of, as it were, I don't want to use the other word workshop culture, but the sense that you're thinking about the development of an idea. And a lot of the events that you've previously had have been allowing insight into practices that are ongoing rather than into finished products. Absolutely. Recognizing that they're in flux.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And also, this moment of sharing, because we, as I said from the very beginning, we don't share the same idea of what feminism, what a feminist practice could possibly be. So I think the best way to do research is to kind of, in a way, with speaking feminism, we are trying to do this kind of performative research, if you want. So just getting together and take it something that's not definitive, but yeah.
And another element that I would like to speak with you about, Alanna, is actually that of organization and that of networking. And I just wanted to briefly bring up the event that you are organizing here on the 11th of January again, Speaking Feminisms in collaboration with the IFA program, another exercise with Tracy Rose. Look it up and do come on the 11th of January. And
one last thing I forgot to say, that of course, like also one of the reasons for speaking feminisms is also the question of how do we create alliances? That's like a very important question.
Well, thanks for allowing for that link, because this is exactly what I wanted to speak about with Alanna. And maybe, could I steal one of these microphones?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
When we first met and talked about this series, the first thing that you said you wanted to speak about is the role of self-organization. And I did find that interesting because you mentioned that BE.BOP, which maybe you could say a word about in a moment, was fundamentally based, just like your practice, in recognizing the necessity of self-organization. And I wondered if you could maybe begin by reflecting a little bit on the emergence of BE.BOP and what it does, but also on this question of self-organization.
I know I promised that, but the previous intervention was so stimulating that I have to disobey myself. Feminist practice in relation to BE.BOP. Today, Elena Quintarelli, who's over there, thanks to her I am able to do BE.BOP. Thank you so much. We had a meeting with Napoli Langa. You know who she is? She's a very, very important feminist, but nobody calls her a feminist. She's somebody that came from Sudan and ended up in a tree in Oranienplatz, protesting the camp that was taken down by the police. Do you remember that protest? Well, she's the woman that climbed up a tree. Today, she's a master's student at the Humboldt University. And when we were discussing kind of what of the many interesting things she could contribute to BE.BOP next year, she said, well, and Elena asked her, I believe you're teaching some workshops. And she said, yes, I'm teaching some workshops. I go to the detention centers and I teach women about activism and sexism because their struggles are usually silenced and they don't have a way to voice because there's so much going on that, you know, they don't know how to deal with the way they are oppressed within the oppression. So I have created what I call now with total confidence a maroon institution, BE.BOP, first to heal myself from my very, very bad experiences with white feminists and, and such other related actors and factors in the art world and in academia. And also to explain my blackness to other black diaspora people because I'm from the Caribbean and my blackness is kind of a puzzle for them. And so BE.BOP is a de facto, or also is like the hidden agenda, the open hidden agenda. It's a Caribbean, quintessentially Caribbean project because most of the constituency is from the Caribbean. But if I speak Caribbean, people immediately go see palm trees. So, you know, I've had to kind of be very strategic about that, as well as a feminist platform where women are in charge. We are in charge in BE.BOP. So having said that, self-organization. So feminist practice, okay. Feminist practices are sometimes not called feminist practices. That's what my point is. Did I make it clear? Did I make it clear? Okay. So self-organization is crucial in order to give continuity to our utopian goals. And once again, going back to Napoli, she was saying that she's making an emphasis in her workshops to teach people in the condition of not having papers that don't wait for money, because if you wait for money, you don't know what you're going to do with the money. First, you have to have a plan, and then you have, then you can, the money will come. So that's exactly how BE.BOP started. First I had this burning desire to make my statement as a curator and as a writer as well, on the ideas that to me were important. One of them was, of course, the colonial theory. And that's how it all came into being, by me being trusting and being trusted. So it's about the dynamics that we enjoy are very much personal, very much about community and creating our own legitimacy. And one of my main ambitions was to have people, scholars working already with the colonial theory, to get to know and become familiar with the work of Black diaspora artists, because the separation was very clear. People that were working with academia were not engaging with art practices. So now that's history. Now we have an incredible amount of publications and network legitimation for each other, and it's a really rewarding sensation to see the publications and to see the interest and in the work of the artists, many of them women, Janet Ehlers, Patricia Kersenhaut, Teresa Maria Diaz-Nerio, and others. So did I answer more or less?
you answered with more than I asked for. But yes,
Okay.
I wondered if you could speak about the upcoming BE.BOP 2018, whether you wanted to, maybe by way of talking through a collaboration with IFA, since next June you will be collaborating together, and I wondered if you wanted to say a word about that.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Alia. Has this like the dream come true when you come into an institution and they say, "How can we help you?" Say, "Hey, that's a good feeling." Thank you so much. We are having 1 day here and 2 days at Gorky Theater. As you probably know, we started with Ballhaus now in Strasse when Shermin was still there, and the next year then she went to the Gorky, so it's now like a re-encounter with Shermin and a new moment for BE.BOP in a way, because I have deliberately contaminated these performing arts with visual arts. So that's kind of what I prefer, that space instead of the white cube. But so this time we're going to be in a white cube, and we're going to do performance that's also is a theater piece with the amazing Patrice Nyambana, from Sierra Leone, based in Birmingham in the UK. He's going to present here The Man Who Committed Thought, and he's like an incredible artist, a thinker, a decolonial thinker. I encourage you to take a note of that day because he's amazing, really. So at the Gorky, we're going to be focused on political activism, and then we're going to have 2 performances there. One is by an Aboriginal Australian senior dancer, a man already in his 60s. His name is Michael Leslie, and he is going to present a new piece that he's developed to thematize the mass incarceration of young black, Aboriginal Australians. And it's called 2.5. It's a super complex solo performance. And then the other one is Into the Dark by Janet Ehlers. I just saw it last week in Copenhagen, and it's now sold out. It's her first attempt at creating a theater piece, and it's an experimental theater piece. It's absolutely fantastic, and I encourage you also to 7 and 8, we're going to be at Gorky. And then we're going to go to London, to a very iconic space in London. It's called Autograph. Have you heard about Autograph ABP? It's a self-organized, very self-organized, incredible legacy. Black photographers, they created their own thing. And David Ajayi, you know who he is? Amazing architect, Nigerian British. And that was his first building 15 years ago. And he was told he could never build anything. And now he has done amazing work. So I cannot stop talking about BE.BOP. Stop me.
So therefore I'm going to stop you by referring to a term that you've already also used, but the one that you also used at the opening lecture at the UDK, and that's the idea of a maroon, or the marooning institution. And you described BE.BOP with reference to your own practice as a marooning institution. And I wondered if you could maybe speak about that briefly in relation to...
Maroons is not a color, a group of people that were running away from the plantation system and creating their own living situation in the mountains most of the time. They were called maroons. So usually canonical historiography telling us that enslavement was so terrible, people couldn't do anything, they just suffer, and that's it. But maroon legacies tell us another story. And now that is really great. In the last 5 years, a lot of research has been done on maroon societies. For example, the first group of independent space geographically was in Colombia. Palenque, San Basilio was before the Haitian Revolution. They were already recognized as being you know, as having legal status even, in isolated in their own spaces. Another very famous, you already know a lot about Maroon. That's how I started my lecture. I don't know if it made a point clear, but I thought it was super clear. Bob Marley's a descendant of Maroons. And his spiritual mentor, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, was a descendant of Maroons. Maroon societies, communities are very much alive in Jamaica. They have even festivals. And another location where they're very, very much present, apart from Colombia and as I said, Jamaica, is Suriname, right? And Gloria Becker, we're dedicating our next BE.BOP is BE.BOP 2018, Coalitions Facing White Innocence. Oh, it's right there. So it's her new book, White Innocence, and there's a subtitle, which is something colonialism and rah-rah. So yes, the Samakas in Suriname are, you know Richard Prince is a very famous anthropologist. Look at my finger. Well, he's like the super expert on Samakas in Suriname. So this idea of creating your own legitimacy, of giving each other, of nurturing each other, comes from this Maroon experience. And as I have learned through my research about the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the subject of my first documentary, I thought, you know, I had all this cool position in political cleverness because I went to a post-structuralist school in university in Mexico, and I read Gramsci and Foucault and, you know, all the post-structuralists and the Frankfurt Schule. And then I realized that, you know, I had all these ideas of self-organization. I value self-organization because it comes from my family. That's what I saw my grandparents do all their lives, you know, founding cooperatives, creating a community park in their area. You know, it just all comes from the ethos of the Black church. So I can continue, but let me stop right there.
Well, in that case, I think we might use this chance actually to open this up for questions from all of you. And we've got 2 microphones that we could pass around in the spirit of the conversation. But first of all, I'd like to thank all 3 of you for being here, and all of you. Are there any questions or comments so that we can pass them around?
Yes, thank you, everyone. I have a quick question related to the title of the talk tonight. Can we go back into art? How do you use this concept of feminism, the way it is, when applied to art? I don't know which one you want to answer.
All 3 of you, I think, could respond to that. Do you maybe want to start by reflecting a little bit more on Wura's work?
Sure. Sure. I mean, so I guess the role. Okay, so the role of art. So I often say I'm not an artist, but I'm increasingly drawn to reflect on the art that I see and experience, and actually going back to some of the artists that Alana has mentioned. So, you know, thank you so much. I also had the immense privilege and pleasure to experience BE.BOP, I want to say 2015, or 14, even earlier. So yeah, how time flies. And a few artists that you mentioned, so like Jeanette Ehlers, Teresa, Patricia, all of their work. So I don't feel that I want to talk on Patricia Kesenhood's behalf, but for instance, the piece that I attended as part of BE.BOP was called Stitches of Power, Stitches of Sorrow. And that's a piece that you are, of course, very familiar with, that also engages, with Maroonage and also with, basically other forms of revolt and resistance that are even prior to the Haitian Revolution, as you mentioned. So for me, I guess where art, what can art do? Speaking from the position not of an artist myself and creating, but experiencing and being increasingly drawn actually to art is really a very, on the one hand, a very physical way in which a lot of art, as you also mentioned, takes place outside of the institutions, for instance, in which I am very familiar, as a researcher, as an academic, in spaces of academia where I am teaching classes, on post-colonial, decolonial studies, on gender and queer studies, on intersectional feminisms. And for me, art is gives a different point of departure for me to reflect on these concerns, which are usually discussed at a very kind of theoretical level. You mentioned Frankfurt School. I don't usually engage with the Frankfurt School in my classes, but where I'm kind of going through, for instance, a reader of texts by decolonial scholars, including your own work, Walter Mignolo's work, and then people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And then the list goes on, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and a lot of these critical thinkers who are writing on a very kind of I guess a very not always, but oftentimes we talk about these in a very abstract manner. So for me, art gives something tangible, and also is a way for me to reflect. In a very different mode, I guess, than simply reading a text and kind of discussing at the same kind of scholarly level. So I guess that would be my contribution. I
would perhaps also just point again to this event in January, because Wura will be here, and as far as I remember, Eva, the curator, will also be here, and they've had an interesting dialogue about curating feminism, curating intersectional feminist works. And there are also two interesting reflections on the Untitled website, both by Eva, the curator, and Wura, who articulate their positions. They're very poetic pieces, I find, that themselves speak to literature as a form of art that engages with these questions. Just so much about that. Other questions or other responses?
I just wanted to say something. I guess for me, as an art critic, as someone who writes about art, I think the intersection of feminisms allows me, for instance, to find other ways and other words or other modes of legitimation, and also to kind of try to write criticism differently, try to understand, especially because I think the art world sees a very, very sexist place where women are usually when the work has something that has some kind of that comes from a personal experience, is usually pretty kind of dismissed as something that is kind of subjective. Or I have the feeling that many art critics don't really find ways, they don't challenge themselves and find ways to speak about the work where they can really go through the different layers. Because when you bring your experience, you are bringing your body, right? Brings everything, brings historical narratives. There is a question of classes, question of race, question of gender. How do we use art criticism to address all the questions, to understand, to give perspective to works? And I think still, there is a lot of work to be done in that sense. So,
Help me with the name of this amazing artist, feminist artist, the video Fuses. We saw her a performance at the Akademikerin Kunst. She's like an icon of feminist. Carole Schneemann. Remember, we saw her together. You know how many pieces she has sold in her whole life, work of her own? One. Yeah, and I think it's fuses. MoMA about it, I think. So what I do as a curator, in my role as curator, is to facilitate, as I said before, the legitimation of the practices of women, black women in the diaspora. And an aftermath of that is that they have been also recognized by institutions and their work is being purchased. So, you know, practice means facilitating, as a curator, facilitating the actual living of artists, right? So, in terms of feminist theory, if that's what you say, like, let's go back to the subject. I don't know what part is going back, because I thought I made a point about BE.BOP being very much focused on women. I think feminist theory is very, very useful for understanding better the inequalities, you know, the imbalances of power and everything. But it doesn't have to be necessarily entitled feminist. And I'm with that title also, let me tell you something. I was very fascinated by the, can you go back to the Grada Quilombas? Yes, is that you, right? Yes. So I told you a little hint about my episode with the white gender studies. At the Humboldt, I can say it, many people who know me, who know this story. I was part of, a colloquium. And one of the meetings we had to write each, our own interpretation of what feminism was. And when I mentioned Grada Quilomba, one of them said that she was not a feminist, right? So this is a very problematic thing. I think what I am very interested in is in what people do with feminist theory, you know. I'm very interested in that, not as in saying this is feminist or this is not feminist. It's really much about, you know, facts and action. And the theory, of course, is super helpful, even if it's only Judith Butler. You know, it can also be other people, but that's okay too, because it serves a certain purpose. It's all context related. I am completely alienated from I'm back in the Dominican Republic more than in Berlin. I live on the same street, by the way. And because of personal reasons, since 2015, and I'm completely alienated from Dominican feminists because they are part of the establishment. They are all paid by the government. They all have jobs with the government, and I am against the government. So there's a moment in life where, you know, they are not my community, they are not my alliances. So it's all different in different contexts, you know. I have incredible affinity with, an admiration more than affinity, with the work of a quintessential feminist artist who is right here. Tanya also, you have been, you know, privileged to be commissioned to write about her work. And I absolutely admire that, what she's doing, you know. And it's like a matter of prioritizing in terms of context. I mean, what is the relevance of putting the title feminist to a certain practice? Sometimes it is not that relevant for me. And it's not for me. Lucky for me, I finally found a group that actually wants, a group of feminists that actually wants me in their group. They're called the Institute of Impossible Subjects, and it was started by a decolonial feminist, Dalida Maria Benfield. And lucky for me, because I'm always like, not really fitting in, you know. And this one is super nice group. Actually, we have fabulous discussions of Silvia Federici. We have a Federici expert in the group, and I learned a lot from feminist theory, you know, and not necessarily related to the arts, you know, because Cristeva is supposed to be out of fashion. That's a pity. Okay.
There is time to ask more questions too, but yes.
Yeah, no, just also, Because I feel like also with feminism is very, not so much about claiming like, oh, I'm a feminist, I hate men. I feel like if feminism can create a space for something different, for an alternative to what we like have, I think that's feminism, and doesn't need necessarily to be called, to be labeled as feminism. But for me, it's really about like thinking ethically. You know, it's a way of being in the world. It has nothing to do with the claim of like, you know, oh, Jess, I did this and I'm a feminist, or if I don't do it, I'm not a feminist. You know, it's just the way you transform yourself into something else. That's how I see it.
You look totally unconvinced.
Which is fine.
Please.
Because I feel inspired. Yeah, because you said many times the word alliances, and I find you said also many times the word alliances, and I find it like very interesting. I'd like you to say a bit more about it. What do you mean exactly by alliances? How do you create one, or like out of the blue?
Oh, it takes a lot of
so I wasn't unconvinced. I just was like, can I ask him the question?
Alliances or coalitions are difficult, very difficult. It takes a lot of talking, and it takes a lot of goodwill, you know, and a common goal. And it's all very strategic, so that's what it goes together. So how do we do it? Do you want an example? Or do you mean out of the blue? What do you mean with out of the blue? What comes out of the blue? Nothing comes out of the blue. We sweat everything we do, you know. It takes a lot of effort. I wouldn't be doing BE.BOP without alliances with other women that are also very encouraging. Actually, I do BE.BOP because, wow, how can I say it? Tanya here introduced me to Walter Mignolo. I always brag about it because, you know, she is a feminist, and she just, Walter was writing about her work, and I have written about her work before, and I said, hey, this is perfect because I've been reading about decolonial theory, and it makes so much sense. I need to meet this man, and she introduced me to him. So this is the type of alliances that we do. I mean, I'm not working with what she does. She's working with Sinti and Roma, and this, and you know, one of the, and also her background in former Yugoslavia, and all this thread of practices that are not what I do or I focus or even read, you know. But then when it comes to freedom of mobility, it's the same or lack of it for people, Sinti and Roma, and for black people in Europe. You know what I'm saying? That's where we come together and we say, how can you explain to me the problematics of your interest? And so I can also, you know, highlight some of the problematics that I deal with. I mean, that's a very simple and very on my face. You should say something, Tanya, because I've mentioned you like 5 times. How do we build coalitions, Tanya? We want to know from you.
Other questions or comments?
Hi, thank you so much. There's a lot of intersection in everybody's work because I'm a scholar of dance studies, so I look at embodied forms of identity, and I can talk more about that in person with all of you. I'm based in the UK, but I'm here on a fellowship at Freie Universität. Anyway, I'm thinking about this idea of the decolonial and decolonial aesthetics, and this question was asked to me when I gave a talk in London, because I also work on decolonial aesthetics, particularly through dance. And so I'm going to ask this to you. What happens when the decolonial no longer is decolonial? That is, when it gets appropriated. Like what efficacy, you know, how does it still maintain its political potential? It's a hard question.
No, it's not hard at all. I deal with it every day. Yeah. Piece of cake.
Yeah. We know those decolonial gestures. What happens when the gesture is no longer decolonial? And I said, well,
yeah,
it shifts.
I will follow my grandfather's tradition and ask you a question in response. So what is when decolonial theory becomes too, I want to quote you. You said something. It's too. No, hold on. Yeah, hold on. Yes, one second. Yeah, I'm going to read something, yeah. So it's overused, becomes overused. Yeah. So how long has Hegel been overused? Foucault being overused? Baudrillard, Barthes, you name it, you know? So who decides the caducidad, you know, the date of expiring date. It's a very tricky question. Now our people are very worried, oh, decoloniality has become too trendy. Hello? What's the problem with that? I don't see any problem with that. I see, of course, a huge problem with commodification, but hello, it's a risk, you know? And if people want to commodify and just use it as a trendy thing, that's their choice. That's, you know, el mundo es ancho y ajeno. The world is a wide space. I know why I do it. I know why I engage with it. And people that work with our group and other people are being very serious about this. If somebody wants to trivialize it, well, they can trivialize the only one. They're not going to trivialize me by default. That's for sure. That's my answer.
True, but I also think there is a challenge there. I feel to, first of all, be very specific. Like, what do you mean when you talk about intersectionality, when feminism? Like this was our discussion. We couldn't agree. Like you know, in the team at Sabvi, like some people say, oh, but I don't want to call myself a feminist, and there was a lot of misunderstanding around this term. That's why we developed the series to kind of try to clarify and to come to maybe a more like a solid and more specific definition of what we mean with that. The other thing is, I think the challenges are also, for me at least, because I love poetry and I love poetic writing, I think maybe the challenge is at that point, how do we find other terms that may be more fitting for us? But that's also, I'm not denying the possibility of using, no, absolutely. And that's why we use feminism, but we had problem with intersectionality a little bit because all of a sudden it was everywhere. So we got a little bit scared. It's just like, oh my God. And we don't want to sound too trendy. So I'm not saying, I think it's important to use it, but I also see it, the challenge of finding other.
I would like to bring in the discussion the term decolonial wounds, and that's exactly the point where I think the colonial aesthetics could be understood as a need, actually to apply, you know, as long as the wounds are to be processed. As long as the things have not been undone, there is a need to decolonize. There is a need for feminist practices, activist practices, decolonizing practices. And I would always bring them in relation, because I don't think that the theory would stand without the practice and activism.
I had, so I hear where you're asking that question from. Yeah, and yeah, like but I would ask the question back of basically who is asking that question, you know? It's like, what is the position, what is that person's position, you know, out of which they are asking that question of like, what happens when, you know, when basically decolonial practices and strategies are no longer necessary? I mean, that is, you know, it's so necessary. It's, you know, for me, you know, decolonial practice and trans-feminist practices go together, you know? I don't see them actually as separate. So for me, you know, thinking through decolonial modes of resistance, of counteracting, of challenging, already include thinking through trans-feminist practices. And, you know, this is necessary as long as, you know, trans people are dying, every day. This happens as long as racism is still alive on so many different levels, on an institutional level, on a structural level, on a personal level. So my question would really be, who is this person, or who are these people asking these questions? Yeah, I guess.
Okay. At this point, thank you all so much. We will stay.